The galaxy did not run on steel or starlight, but on borrowed time. The Ethel saw to that. To the 100 subject races of their dominion, the Ethel were not merely rulers, they were eternity made manifest, slender, iridescent beings whose thoughts drifted through the ether as visible light. They had conquered death itself. Their power flowed from the lumen, a symbiotic consciousness they had discovered ages ago, a living energy that permeated their very cells, halting decay, sharpening their minds to a crystalline edge, and granting them a serene, unshakable confidence that bordered on divinity. They ruled from the sanctuary, a world of spun glass and living coral, a monument to a civilization that no longer had to contemplate its own end. All other species were fleeting, transient sparks in the great cosmic dark, living and dying in the blink of an Ethel's eye. And none were more fleeting, more flawed than the humans. When humanity stumbled out of its solar cradle, blinking in the galactic dawn, the Ethel had classified them with a detached, almost sorrowful pity. They were biologically incompatible with the lumen symbiosis, a genetic dead end. The life-giving energy simply passed through them, finding no purchase, no anchor in their chaotic DNA. The Ethel named them the Vacui, the Hollow Ones, a species born without a soul, destined to live their frantic, brief lives consumed by messy emotions and the constant, nagging terror of their own mortality. They were a curiosity, a biological mistake, and so they were put to work where their short, expendable lives were most useful, the brutal, high-gravity mining colony on Cygnus X1. There, amidst the crushing pressures and lethal radiation that even Ethel technology could only partially mitigate, humanity dug out the raw tenebrium that fueled the Dominion's star-faring vessels. They were paid in clean water, recycled air, and the continued, contemptuous tolerance of their immortal masters. Kalen Vance knew the weight of that contempt every day. It was in the way the Ethel overseer, Xylo, glided through the colony's central dome, its luminous form never touching the grated floor, its thoughts a shimmering cascade of condescension that the universal translator struggled to soften. The Hollow Ones toil so, the Thoughtcast would say, a statement of fact that felt like a judgment. Kalen, a xenobotanist by training, was there not for the tenebrium, but for the one thing that grew on this God's forsaken rock grave mold. It was a pathetic, gray-green fungus that thrived in the radiation-soaked crevices of the mine shafts, a life form that had no business existing. Yet it did, and it fascinated him. He spent his days in a small, pressurized biodome, coaxing the mold to grow in petri dishes, mapping its bizarre genome. His work was dismissed by the Ethel as a quaint human hobby, a way for one of the vacui to distract himself from the inevitable. But for Kalen, it was an escape. His true purpose on Cygnus X1 was not in his lab. It was in the small living quarter he shared with his wife, Ilara, and their 7-year-old daughter, Lyra. Ilara was an engineer, her hands calloused from maintaining the colony's failing life support systems, her face etched with a weariness that went deeper than exhaustion. Lyra was their light, a child born in a cage who only knew a sky of reinforced plasteel. She would draw pictures of imaginary suns and green fields on her datapad, worlds she had only heard about in Kalen's stories. When will we see a real tree? Papa, she'd ask, her voice a small, hopeful chime in the sterile hum of the recycler. Soon, starlight. He would lie, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. When my work is done, we'll petition for a transfer. We'll go to a world with a real sky. It was a lie they all clung to. No human had ever left Cygnus X1 save for in a corpse reclamation unit. The lie was their most precious possession. The end began with a tremor. It was not the usual shudder of the mining explosives or the groan of the colony's stressed superstructure. This was a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the soles of Kalen's boots and made the vials in his lab rattle. An alarm blared, a discordant shriek that cut through the dome's quiet. Alara's voice came over his comm, strained and breathless. "Kyle, it's the primary energy conduit. The regulator is failing. The whole thing is going to overload." He could hear shouting in the background, the rising panic of 1,000 people trapped miles beneath the surface of a hostile moon. "Can you fix it?" he asked, his own voice tight. "The parts are Ethel Tech. We need Xylo to authorize the shutdown sequence, but the overload is interfering with comms to the surface spire. I can't reach him." The spire was where the Ethel overseers resided, a crystalline tower that stretched into the thin, toxic atmosphere, a world away from the grime and danger of the human colony below. Xylo would be meditating, likely contemplating the elegant flow of cosmic energies, unconcerned with the frantic scurrying of the ants in his farm. "I'm on my way," Kalen said, sealing his samples of grave mold in a stasis locker out of pure, unthinking habit. He ran from the biodome, the emergency lights painting the corridors in a hellish red glow. He found Ilara near the conduit chamber, her face pale under a sheen of sweat. "The core temperature is redlining," she said, pointing to a frantically blinking display. "If it breaches, the entire cavern will be vaporized." Just then, the main view screen at the end of the corridor flickered to life. It showed Xylo, its form shimmering with a placid, untroubled light. Its backdrop, the serene interior of the spire. Its translated voice was calm, melodic, utterly devoid of urgency. "We are aware of the energy fluctuation in the primary conduit," it announced, its gaze seemingly directed at every colonist at once. "The integrity of the automated mining assembly is our chief priority. The tenebrium extraction must not be compromised." Ilara stared at the screen, her expression a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. "The mining assembly that's on the far side of the cavern. To save it, they'd have to vent the colony, purge the atmosphere to cool the core from the outside." The unspoken words hung between them. They would kill us all to save a machine. "They wouldn't," Kalen whispered. But the conviction in his voice was hollow. He thought of Lyra, alone in their quarters, probably hiding under her bed, clutching the datapad with its pictures of a world she would never see. "Xylo." "You can't." Ilara screamed at the screen, her voice cracking. "There are 1,000 people here. My daughter is here." Xylo's form seemed to tilt, a gesture of mild curiosity. "The breeding cycle of the Hollow Ones is remarkably efficient. Your stock will be replenished. The assembly, however, is irreplaceable." That was it. No malice, no anger, just the simple, brutal arithmetic of the immortal. A series of heavy thuds echoed through the colony as massive steel plates began to slide into place, sealing the main habitat from the mining cavern. A new alarm began to sound, a slow, deep toll. Atmospheric purge in 5 minutes. Panic, raw and absolute, erupted. People ran, screamed, trampled one another in a desperate, futile rush for sealed-off exits. Kalen grabbed Alara's hand. The biodome. He gasped, his lungs burning. My lab. It has its own life support, a closed system. We can make it. They ran against the tide of terrified bodies, pushing through a sea of despair. They were almost there, the sealed hatch to his research section just 50 feet away, when a secondary explosion rocked the corridor. A support beam, white-hot and twisted, collapsed from the ceiling, pinning Ilara's legs beneath it. Kalen tried to lift it, his muscles screaming in protest, the metal searing his hands. It was no use. Ilara looked up at him, her face grimly calm, her eyes full of a love that was suddenly, unbearably painful. Go, she rasped, blood trickling from her lips. Lyra. Get to Lyra. The tolling continued. 2 minutes. He shook his head, tears blurring his vision. No. I'm not leaving you. There's no time for both, she said, her voice weakening. You can't save me. Save our daughter. Let me die knowing she's with you. Promise me. Kyle, promise me. The finality in her voice shattered him. He kissed her one last time, his tears mingling with the blood on her face. I promise. He choked out. Then he ran. He sprinted through the corridors, his heart hammering against his ribs. Alara's final word echoing in his mind. Promise. He burst into their quarters. Lyra was there, curled up under her small desk, clutching her datapad. She looked up, her eyes wide with fear. Papa! What's happening? He scooped her into his arms, holding her tight. We're going on an adventure. Starlight. To the biodome. We have to be fast. 1 minute. He carried her, his small, precious burden, and ran faster than he had ever run in his life. The biodome hatch was just ahead. He could see the green light indicating a positive seal. They were going to make it. He was 20 feet away when the world turned to a deafening roar of venting air. The pressure dropped instantly. A violent, physical blow that sucked the breath from his lungs and pulled at his body. He was still inside the colony's main structure. The purge had started from the far end, but the cascade was instantaneous. He saw the bodies of his fellow colonists contort, the air erupting from their lungs, the blood boiling in their veins. He sealed his eyes shut, holding Lyra tight against his chest, trying to shield her from the horror, when he felt a sharp, searing pain in his side. A piece of shrapnel from a bursting bulkhead had torn through his suit and into his flesh. He stumbled, his vision swimming, but his grip on Lyra never faltered. With the last of his strength, he lunged for the hatch control, slapping his palm against the activation panel just as his consciousness began to fade. The heavy door hissed shut behind him, sealing him and his daughter inside the sanctuary of his lab. He collapsed onto the floor, Lyra safe in his arms. The last thing he heard before the blackness took him was the faint, tinny sound of the Dominion's official broadcast signal, which his lab equipment had picked up. It was the Ethel ambassador from the sanctuary, its voice a symphony of detached compassion. We mourn the loss of life on Cygnus X1. It is a tragedy when such flawed stock perishes, but the Dominion is eternal, and its work must continue. The colony will be repopulated, and the flow of tenebrium will be restored. Kalen lay in a spreading pool of his own blood, his daughter unconscious on his chest, the ambassador's words echoing in the sudden, absolute silence of 1,000 murdered souls. He did not know if he would live or die. But in that final moment of awareness, a single, cold thought crystallized in the ruins of his mind. A thought that would become the seed of a vengeance the galaxy could not possibly comprehend. You don't see us as living beings, he thought, as the faces of Alara and Lyra flashed behind his eyes. You see us as stock. You think our mortality makes us weak. I will show you. I will show you all what it means to be hollow. Silence was the new sound of the universe. When Kalen awoke, it was the first thing he registered. A profound and terrifying absence of noise that was more deafening than the explosion that had nearly killed him. The sterile white light of his biodome's ceiling seemed impossibly bright, and the pain in his side was a hot, sharp anchor pulling him back to a reality he did not want to face. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming, his head throbbing with a dull, persistent ache. Lyra was asleep on a medical cot he didn't remember putting her on, her small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. She was alive. The thought was a flare of warmth in the frozen wasteland of his soul. He stumbled to a diagnostic panel, his own reflection, a ghostly stranger in the dark screen, gaunt, wild-eyed, a crude biofoam patch sealing the ragged wound in his side. He had done that on instinct, a half-conscious act of survival. The dome's chronometer told him he'd been unconscious for nearly 30 hours. 30 hours of silence. He accessed the external sensors, his hand trembling. The screen resolved into a view of the colony's central plaza, now a vacuum-swept tomb of twisted metal and frozen, contorted bodies. His people, his friends, his wife. He saw a shape that might have been Alara near the crushed conduit chamber, and a wave of nausea washed over him so intense he had to grip the console for support. He shut the feed off. The image seared into his memory. He was in a bubble of life surrounded by a graveyard of his own making, a graveyard sanctioned by gods who measured lives in terms of efficiency. He spent the next week in a haze of grief and methodical survival. He tended to his wound, rationed their small supply of nutrient paste, and held Lyra whenever she woke from nightmares, whispering reassurances that were ash in his own mouth. It was on the 8th day that Lyra, looking out of the viewport at the silent, dead colony, asked the question that solidified his purpose. "Pop," she said, her voice small and fragile. "Are we the only ones left?" He knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around her tiny frame. "Here. Yes," he said, his voice thick. "But there are more of us. Starlight. On other worlds. On Earth." She looked up at him, her eyes ancient with a sorrow no child should ever know. Will the shiny people kill them, too? And there it was. The future. The Ethel wouldn't stop. They wouldn't learn. They were eternal. And, to them, humanity was a recurring, predictable error. His promise to Alara had been to save their daughter, but that was no longer enough. He had to save her from a future of being considered stock. He had to unmake the gods who had made him a widower and his daughter an orphan. His gaze drifted to the other side of the lab, to the sealed stasis locker containing his life's work, the grave mold, an insignificant fungus, a biological curiosity. He opened the locker and stared at the petri dishes, at the gray-green fuzz clinging to the nutrient gel. On a whim, he ran a deep-level bioscan, comparing its current state to the data from before the explosion. An anomaly flagged his attention. One of the samples, the one closest to the outer wall of the biodome during the energy conduit's overload, was different. Its cellular structure was agitated. Its energy consumption had spiked to 1,000 times its normal rate. It was feeding on the residual radiation from the blast. That was expected. But it was also feeding on something else. A faint, almost undetectable energy signature that lingered in the dome's plating. The lumen. The overload in the etheltech conduit had bled trace amounts of the ethel's lifeblood into the environment. And the mold, the pathetic fungus that shouldn't even exist, was eating it. A cold, electric thrill shot through Kalen, the first feeling other than grief he'd experienced in days. He was a botanist, a man who understood how life, in its infinite, desperate hunger, could adapt and overcome. He began to work, his grief channeled into a feverish, obsessive focus. He was no longer a scientist seeking knowledge. He was a weaponsmith forging a sword. He exposed the mold to concentrated, controlled bursts of the lumen energy signature, which he managed to replicate from the dome's data logs of Xylo's previous visits. At first, the energy disintegrated the fungus, but Kalen was a master of genetic manipulation. He sequenced, spliced, and recoded, creating thousands of variations, pushing the mold to adapt. He worked tirelessly, sleeping only when his body gave out, his dreams filled with Ilara's dying face and Xylo's shimmering, indifferent form. He was creating a predator for a species that had none. After 6 weeks of relentless trial and error, he had it. A new strain of the grave mold. It looked no different from the original, but it was infinitely more sinister. It was no longer just resistant to the lumen, it was ravenous for it. It was a biological key designed for a single, divine lock. When introduced to a medium saturated with the lumen, it didn't just consume the energy, it inverted it. It hijacked the symbiotic process, turning the very source of ethel immortality into a catalyst for rapid, cascading cellular decay. It was a tailored poison, a disease that targeted the soul. He called it the vacancy strain. It would make the ethel hollow, just as they had named his people. It would give the gift of mortality back to those who had forgotten its price. Now he had a weapon, but he was still trapped in a cage. The colony was silent, but it wouldn't be forever. The ethel had said they would repopulate. Ships would come. That was his way out. He began to teach Lyra. The time for stories of green fields was over. He taught her engineering, pulling up Ilara's old schematics and making her memorize the layouts of ethel reclamation drones and scout ships. He taught her stealth, how to move without a sound, how to read energy signatures on a scanner. He taught her hatred, a cold, patient hatred that burned like a pilot light, not a wildfire. He showed her the footage of the plaza, of their frozen neighbors. He made her listen to Xylo's proclamation. He was robbing her of her childhood, and he knew it. He was reforging his daughter into a tool, just as he had reforged the mold. The guilt was a physical weight, but it was dwarfed by the certainty of his mission. One day, she pointed to the shimmering image of Xylo on a paused recording. "He is the one who killed Mama," she stated, her voice devoid of childish inflection. It was a simple, factual declaration. "Yes," Kalen said softly. "And we are the ones who will make him remember her." Their chance came 3 months after the purge. An automated reclamation drone, a massive, spider-like vessel, descended from the sky and began the grim work of clearing the colony. Its robotic arms clinically gathering the frozen bodies for incineration. Kalen and Lyra watched from the biodome, Hidden behind polarized viewports, the drone was their taxi. Their plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. They would use the colony's maintenance tunnels to reach the primary docking bay, attach a modified cargo container to the drone's underbelly, and ride it up to the surface spire where the Ethel overseers lived and where their interstellar vessels were docked. In that container was a small case containing a dozen vials of the vacancy strain. He had genetically coded it to be airborne, transmitted through the same recycled atmosphere the Ethel breathed with such casual confidence. Once in the spire's ventilation system, it would be undetectable until it was too late. For the Ethel, a species that hadn't known sickness in millennia, the very concept of quarantine or contagion was a forgotten footnote in their ancient history. It was the perfect crime. The night before they were to leave, Kaylin found Lyra sitting in front of her datapad, looking at the drawings she had made of Earth, a world with green trees, blue oceans, and a yellow sun. "Will we ever go there?" "Papa," she asked, not looking at him. Kaylin sat beside her, the weight of their future pressing down on him. "I don't know," he answered, for the first time telling her the complete truth. "Our work, it might take a long time. We might not get to see it." Lyra was silent for a moment. Then she swiped the screen, replacing the image of Earth with a schematic of the spire's ventilation system that he had been drilling into her memory. "This is more important," she said. He pulled her into a hug, his heart aching. He had saved her life only to take it from her. They left the biodome the next cycle, slipping into the cold, silent darkness of the dead colony. They moved like ghosts through the maintenance tunnels, Kaylin's rifle held at the ready, Lyra a small, silent shadow at his heels. They navigated the labyrinthine passages using the maps Ilara had designed, her presence a guiding hand from beyond the grave. They reached the docking bay without incident. The reclamation drone was massive, a mountain of black alloy and glowing sensors, its mechanical limbs working with a tireless, eerie grace. Hiding in the shadows of the gantry, Kylan prepped the cargo container, securing its magnetic clamps. He looked at Lyra, her small face illuminated by the faint glow of the drone's running lights. She was no longer just his daughter. She was his partner, his legacy, his sin and his salvation. "Ready." "Starlight," he whispered. She gave a single, determined nod, her eyes fixed on the crystalline tower that pierced the sky above, the home of the creature that had murdered her mother. Together, they sealed themselves inside the cold, dark container. Kaylin activated the clamps, and with a heavy thud, their tiny metal shell locked onto the belly of the beast. A few moments later, a low vibration ran through the floor as the drone's powerful engines began to hum. They were rising from the grave of Cygnus X1, carrying a judgment the galaxy's immortals had long since forgotten they deserved. They were no longer victims. They were a plague, and they were about to be released. The ascent was a blind, jarring journey into the heart of the enemy. Inside the cramped, pitch-black cargo container, every groan of the drone's machinery, every shift of its massive frame, was amplified into a deafening roar. Kaylin held Lyra close, the small, steady beat of her heart against his chest, the only thing keeping his own from hammering out of his ribcage. He had planned for every contingency he could imagine: equipment failure, detection, structural collapse, but he had not planned for the crushing, claustrophobic intimacy of their ascent. In the darkness, he was not a vengeful specter, but a father, clutching his child, acutely aware that his grand design for justice rested on the fragile hope that a few magnetic clamps would hold. The vibration changed, smoothing out as the drone docked with the spire. A soft chime, barely audible through the hull, signaled its arrival. This was it. Kalen checked the external sensor feed on his wrist-mounted display. They were in the spire's primary receiving bay, a cavernous space of polished white surfaces and soft, ambient light. Automated arms were already detaching cargo raw tenebrium from the automated mines, not the drone's grim harvest from the colony, and sending it deeper into the spire on silent, floating platforms. Their container, an unscheduled and unregistered piece of debris, sat ignored in a corner of the bay. So far, so good. He had 20 minutes before the drone was scheduled to begin its incineration cycle, a process that would have vaporized them along with the dead. Phase 2, he whispered, his voice hoarse. Lyra nodded, her face a pale oval in the faint green light of his display. She was already pulling on her small, custom-fit infiltration suit, her movements precise and economical. She looked like a miniature soldier, and the sight of it was a fresh stab of guilt in Kalen's heart. He pushed the feeling down. Guilt was a luxury he could no longer afford. He activated a small, handheld laser, cutting a precise circle out of the container's floor. A moment later, they dropped silently onto the pristine deck of the receiving bay. The air here was different, carrying a faint, ozone-like scent that he recognized from his research, the signature of the lumen. It was like breathing in the enemy's soul. They moved into the shadows, a pair of gray ghosts in a world of luminous white. The spire was a testament to ethel aesthetics, all graceful curves, seamless junctions, and flowing light. There were no guards, no visible security. Why would there be? The ethel had no predators. They had forgotten the very concept of a physical threat. They passed observation windows that looked down upon the ravaged surface of Cygnus X1, a scarred moon, lit by the eerie glow of its parent star. From up here, the dead colony was just a dark patch on the ground, an abstraction. Kalen imagined Xylo looking out this very window, its thoughts untroubled, its immortality unthreatened. The thought was fuel. They reached the primary ventilation shaft, a colossal vertical tunnel that served as the spire's lung. According to Ilar's schematics, this was the central hub, from which atmosphere was circulated to every level, including the upper sanctums where the ethel resided. Kalen prized open a maintenance hatch, revealing a network of humming machinery and rushing air. The roar from within was immense. He took the small, lead-lined case from his pack and opened it. Inside, nestled in soft foam, were the 12 vials of the vacancy strain, each one a universe of death in miniature. He handed one to Lyra. You remember the sequence. She recited it without hesitation, her voice clear and steady over the noise of the shaft. Attach the vial to the aerosolizer. Set a 30-second timer. Secure it to the intake manifold. The positive airflow will do the rest. Her proficiency was chilling. Papa, she said, looking up at him, her eyes catching the light from the shaft. When the shiny people get sick, will it hurt? The question caught him off guard. In all his planning, his rage, his meticulous preparation, he had thought of the ethel as a concept, a system to be broken. He had not considered their pain. Yes, he said, the word tasting like poison. I imagine it will. He had expected her to flinch, to show a child's fear or pity. Instead, she just nodded slowly. Good. She turned, and, with the agility of a creature born in the shadows, slipped into the maintenance conduit. Kalen followed, his larger frame making it a tighter squeeze. They worked in silence, their headlamps cutting sharp beams through the dusty dark. They placed the aerosolizers at precise intervals, a constellation of tiny, patient time bombs. Kalen's hands were steady, his mind a cold, clear instrument of vengeance. But as he set the last vial in place, his fingers brushed against the cool glass, and for a fleeting second, he felt the colossal weight of what he was doing. He was about to commit xenocide. He was about to unleash a plague that would not distinguish between Xylo and any other Ethel in the Spire. It would kill them all, the guilty and were any of them truly innocent, they had all benefited from the Dominion, from the system that saw his people as disposable. They had basked in the glow of their immortality while his species withered and died in their minds. No, he decided, his resolve hardening. There were no innocents here, just the architects of his wife's murder. They retreated from the shaft, sealing the hatch behind them just as the first timer reached zero. There was no sound, no flash of light, just the silent, invisible release of his creation into the Spire's lifeblood. The vacancy strain was airborne. The first sign that something was wrong came not from an alarm, but from a change in the light. The soft, ambient glow of the spire began to flicker, to pulse with a sickly, discordant rhythm. Kalen and Lyra watched from a darkened observation deck as an Ethel glided down a distant corridor. Mid-stride, its luminous form wavered, like a reflection on troubled water. It paused, one slender hand rising to its head in a gesture that looked disturbingly human, a gesture of confusion, of pain. Then, its light sputtered and died, its physical body, a thing of grace and elegance just moments before, crumpled to the floor, a heap of pale, lifeless flesh. It had happened. The vacancy had taken hold. It was working faster than he had ever anticipated. The symbiotic lumen was not just being consumed, it was being violently, explosively inverted. The Ethel's immortality was devouring them from within. Soon, others began to fall. The serene, gliding movements of the Spire's inhabitants became erratic, stumbling. Their thoughtcasts, once melodic and controlled, became shrieks of static and terror that even Kalen's unattuned mind could feel as a pressure against his skull. The Dominion's gods were discovering fear. He and Lyra began their ascent to the docking bay, moving through a world that was descending into chaos. They passed Ethel, who were clawing at their own iridescent skin, their light fading in patches, revealing the mortal, vulnerable flesh beneath. They saw others simply staring into the distance, their minds shattered by the sudden, brutal intrusion of mortality. They had lived for eons without the concept of an ending, and its arrival was not a gentle fading, but a psychological cataclysm. They reached the upper docking bay, a magnificent hangar filled with the sleek, organic-looking starships of the Ethel fleet. Their prize was the Stellara, a smallest long-range courier vessel docked at the far end of the bay. According to the manifest Ilara had archived, it was the fastest ship of its class, capable of traversing half the galaxy without refueling. It was their ark. As they approached the ship's ramp, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Xylo. Its form was flickering violently, its light a pale, sickly green. Patches of its body were already dull and gray. It had been infected. But unlike the others, It was not panicking. Its luminous eyes, now dimmed with pain, fixed on Kalen. Its thought cast was weak, ragged, but clear. The hollow. One. It projected. The words laced with a dawning, horrified understanding. This is your work. You brought this ending, to us. You brought it on yourselves, Kalen said, raising his rifle, the weapon feeling clumsy and inadequate in the face of this fallen divinity. You killed my wife. You murdered 1,000 people and called it an operational necessity. Xylo's form shuddered. We did not understand. Mortality. It is a horror. The fear. It burns. For the first time, Kalen felt a flicker of something other than hatred. It wasn't pity, but a cold, academic curiosity. He was a scientist witnessing the results of his ultimate experiment. Now you know how we live every day, he said. He expected Xylo to attack, to lash out with some unknown lethal power, but it didn't. Instead, it sank to its knees, its form shrinking, its light fading to a final, desperate ember. The Dominion. It whispered. Its last thought cast a plea not to Kalen, but to the universe. It was eternal. And then the light went out for good. Xylo, the immortal overseer of Cygnus X1, was dead. Kalen stood over the body, the rifle still raised. He had expected to feel a sense of triumph, of release, but there was only a vast, chilling emptiness. He had killed his monster, but the ghosts of his past were not silenced. He felt a small hand slip into his. Lyra was looking at the dead Ethel, her expression unreadable. Is it over? Papa, she asked. Kalen looked around the dying spire, at the flickering lights and the fallen gods. He looked at the starship that promised escape. He looked at his daughter, her eyes reflecting the chaos around them. No. Starlight, he said, his voice heavy with a new, terrible purpose. It's just the beginning. This was just one tower. There's a whole galaxy of them. He led her up the ramp of the Stellara. The ship powered on at his touch. Its systems intuitively designed. As the ramp sealed behind them, shutting out the dying screams of the spire, he guided the vessel out of the hangar and into the blackness of space. Below them, the spire of Cygnus X1 went dark, one level at a time, like a candle being snuffed out. Kalen Vance, the Hollow Man, the grieving xenobotanist, was gone. In his place was a plague-bringer, a man who held the death of a species in his hands, with his daughter as his sole witness and accomplice. He had stolen immortality from the gods. Now, he was going to deliver it to their entire civilization, one world at a time. The ship's navigation system lit up, a holographic map of the Dominion. At its center, a blazing sun of light, the sanctuary, the Ethel homeworld. He set his course. The Stellara was a ghost ship, a sliver of stolen grace moving through the silent, star-strewn ocean of the Dominion. Inside, the silence was a different kind, heavier and more profound than the one they had left behind in the tomb of Cygnus X1. It was the silence of a future unwritten, a silence filled with the enormity of what they had done and what they were about to do. Kalen had thought that escaping the spire would be a release, but it was merely a transfer from one prison to another. The ship was a marvel of ethel engineering, its walls glowing with soft light, its systems responding to his thoughts. But it was still a cage, a gilded vessel carrying him and his daughter deeper into a darkness of his own making. He spent the first few ship cycles familiarizing himself with the vessel, his mind a machine of cold calculation. He studied the star charts, memorized the patrol routes of the Dominion fleet, and delved into the ship's archives. The Ethel, in their arrogance, had not felt the need for encryption. Their history, their philosophy, their biology, it was all there. An open book for him to read. He learned that their symbiosis with the Lumen was more profound than he had ever imagined. It was not just biological, it was spiritual. The Lumen connected them all in a collective consciousness, a serene, endless sea of shared thought and experience. To be Ethel was to be part of an eternal chorus. The vacancy strain did not just kill their bodies, it ripped them from that chorus, casting them into the terrifying silence of individuality before extinguishing their light. It was a uniquely cruel weapon, and the knowledge of its cruelty settled in his gut like a shard of ice. Lyra, however, adapted to their new life with a disquieting ease. The ship was the first real home she had ever known that wasn't under the constant threat of collapse. She explored its curving corridors, her small feet silent on the glowing decks. She learned to pilot the ship with an intuitive skill that surpassed his own, her small hands dancing over the holographic controls. But there was a stillness in her, a watchfulness that hadn't been there before. The child who had once drawn pictures of imaginary suns was gone. In her place was a girl who studied weapon schematics and memorized the chemical composition of the vacancy strain. She would sit for hours in the ship's cockpit, staring at the star map, her expression as vast and empty as the void outside. One cycle, he found her in the ship's small hydroponics bay, a place he had been avoiding. The Ethel had grown crystalline flora that chimed with soft, melodic light. She was touching one of the plants, her head tilted. "They made beautiful things," she said, her voice soft. It was not an accusation, but it felt like one. "Yes," he said, his throat tight. "They did." The people on the other worlds. "Are they all like Xylo?" she asked, her gaze still fixed on the plant. "Most of them." "Yes," he admitted. "They live in the comfort of their eternity, while others suffer for it. Will we have to kill them all?" The question hung in the air, as fragile and beautiful as the glass flower she was touching. He wanted to lie. He wanted to tell her that they would only punish the guilty, that they would find a way to spare the innocent. But he had started this journey with a promise to his dying wife, and he would not compound his sins with lies to his daughter. "The strain. It can't tell the difference," he said, the words feeling inadequate, monstrous. "Once it's released, it will spread. It's the only way to be sure. The Dominion can never hurt anyone again." She was silent for a long time, her small finger tracing the glowing edge of a petal. Then she looked at him, her eyes clear and unwavering. "Okay," she said. And that single word, spoken with such calm, chilling acceptance, was more terrifying than any scream. He was not just her father, he was her God, shaping her universe, defining her morality, and he was shaping her into a monster. His first target was not the sanctuary. A direct assault on the homeworld was suicide. He needed to test the strain on a larger scale, to understand its transmission patterns, and to sow the seeds of chaos throughout the Dominion. He chose the world of Ethelgard, a major administrative hub and fleet depot on the Outer Rim. It was a world not of glass and coral, but of stark, functional architecture, a military heart pumping ships and soldiers out to the colonial arteries of the Dominion. Disabling it would be a crippling blow. He would not need to land. The Stellara's sensors could analyze the planet's atmospheric composition from orbit. He could modify the strain to survive in the upper stratosphere, to bind with water molecules and rain down upon the unsuspecting world. It was a horrifyingly elegant delivery system. As they approached the Ethelgard system, they began to see the first signs that news of Cygnus X-1 had not been contained. There were more naval patrols, their flight patterns tighter, more alert. Dominion comm channels, usually a calm river of open communication, were now a torrent of encrypted, panicked bursts. They were looking for a ghost, a phantom threat they couldn't yet comprehend. Kalen reconfigured the Stellara's energy signature, cloaking it in the guise of a common cargo freighter. He was a virus, and he had learned the art of camouflage. They slipped past the outer patrols and took up a high, geosynchronous orbit over Ethelgard's northern pole. The planet below was a swirl of gray clouds and city lights, a picture of orderly, oblivious life. Kalen worked in the ship's small lab, making the final modifications to the strain. Lyra stood beside him, a silent apprentice, handing him instruments, monitoring the atmospheric readings. They were a team, a two-person apocalypse. "Dispersion vector is optimal," Lyra said, her voice a flat monotone. "Atmospheric pressure and temperature are within viable parameters. We can release it now." Kalen took a deep breath. This was it. The moment he escalated his personal revenge into a galactic war. He looked at Lyra, at her small, serious face, and for a moment, he saw the child she should have been, playing in a field under a real sun, her hands dirty with soil, not sterilized by a lab. A wave of doubt, cold and overwhelming, washed over him. What was he doing? Was this justice, or was it just a bigger, more elaborate form of murder? Was he honoring Alara's memory, or was he desecrating it? Papa Lyra's voice cut through his thoughts. She was looking at him with concern, her brow furrowed. "Are you okay?" He looked from her face to the image of the planet on the main screen. He thought of Xylo's casual dismissal of his people. "The breeding cycle of the Hollow Ones is remarkably efficient. Your stock will be replenished." He remembered the sight of his wife, crushed and dying, her last breath a plea to save their child. And his doubt hardened back into resolve. The Ethel had made a choice. They had chosen efficiency over empathy, eternity over compassion. They had built their perfect, beautiful world on a foundation of bones, and they had never once looked down. He was not a monster. He was a consequence. "I'm fine," he said, his voice steady. "Initiate the release sequence." He pressed a single, glowing icon on the control panel. On the ship's exterior, a small canister detached and tumbled into the upper atmosphere. It was a silent, unremarkable event. A tiny, man-made meteor carrying a fire that would burn out as civilization. They stayed in orbit for 3 days, cloaked and silent, watching their work unfold. The first day, nothing happened. On the second day, the planet's communication network went haywire. Panic began to bleed through the encryption. By the third day, the lights of the cities began to flicker and die. Sensor readings showed a catastrophic drop in energy output across the globe. The Fleet Depot, once a bustling hub of activity, fell silent. The ships in its orbital docks drifted, lifeless and dark. It was Cygnus X1 magnified 1,000,000 times. Kalen felt no satisfaction, no triumph, only a cold, hollow ache. He had proven his point. He had shown the gods of the Dominion that even they could die. Just as they were preparing to leave the system, a single ship detached from the dead fleet and began to drift towards them. It was a small patrol vessel, its energy signature fluctuating wildly. It wasn't an attack. It was a plea, a distress call. A single desperate message came through on an open channel, a raw, unfiltered ethel thoughtcast, ragged with pain and terror. Help us. The light is failing. What is this? What is happening? Kalen stared at the message, his hand frozen over the controls. It was the voice of a being that had never known pain, now drowning in it, reaching out in the dark for a hand that wasn't there. Lyra looked at the screen, then at him. "Are we going to answer?" she asked. He thought of the 1,000 unanswered screams in the corridors of Cygnus X1. He thought of Ilara. He cut the channel. He turned the Stellara away from the dying world and the ghost ship calling out for a savior who would not come. He pushed the ship's engines to their limit, and they jumped into the black, leaving the silence of Ethelgard behind them. But as they sped towards their next target, a new, unsettling thought began to take root in Kalen's mind. He had started this war to show the Ethel what it meant to be mortal. But as he looked at the reflection of his own hard, emotionless face in the cockpit's viewport, he had to wonder in his quest to teach them about humanity. How much of his own had he burned away? The journey to the sanctuary was a long, silent fall through the heart of a dying empire. News of Ethelgard's demise had spread like a shockwave, and the serene, ordered Dominion Kalen had set out to destroy was tearing itself apart. Systems cut off from the central authority fell into chaos. Subject races, sensing weakness in their immortal masters for the first time in millennia, began to rise up in bloody, opportunistic rebellions. The Ethel, a species that had not known true conflict for ages, were incapable of responding. They were fighting a war on two fronts, one against the ghosts of their past, and another against the insidious, invisible enemy that was rotting them from within. Kalen and Lyra watched it all unfold from the cockpit of the Stellara, a pair of silent observers to the galactic fire they had ignited. They were no longer hunters. They were simply waiting for the blaze to reach the heart of the forest. Kalen found himself adrift. The cold, clear purpose that had guided him from the ruins of Cygnus X1 had become clouded. With every world that went dark, every panicked communication they intercepted, the righteousness of his cause felt less certain. He had wanted to teach the Ethel a lesson, but the lesson had become a conflagration, burning everything in its path. He saw Ilara's face in his dreams, but her expression was no longer one of pained love. It was one of sorrow, of disappointment. He was becoming the very thing he sought to destroy: a cold, calculating force that weighed lives on a scale of strategic value. He spent less time in the lab and more time staring at the star charts, the glowing dot representing the sanctuary, feeling less like a target and more like a final, damning destination. The change in him did not go unnoticed. Lyra watched him, her quiet, observant gaze missing nothing. She had taken over most of the ship's daily operations, her small frame moving with an unnerving confidence through the glowing corridors. She was the one who monitored the comm channels, who plotted their course through collapsing trade routes, who ensured their energy signature remained hidden. She was the mission's custodian now, and he was becoming its passenger. one ship cycle. As he stared blankly at the swirling nebula outside the viewport, she approached him, holding out her datapad. On the screen was one of her old drawings from Cygnus X1, a crude but vibrant picture of a green field under a yellow sun. "You don't tell me stories about Earth anymore," she said. It wasn't a question. The simple statement struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had been so focused on endings, the end of the Ethel, the end of the Dominion, that he had forgotten about beginnings. He had forgotten the world he was supposedly fighting for. "There hasn't been much time for stories." "Starlight," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Is it because we're not going back?" she asked, her eyes searching his. "Is this our life now, watching worlds die before he could answer?" An alarm chimed softly. They had arrived. The sanctuary system. Kalen's breath caught in his throat. He had expected a fortress, a world ringed with warships and planetary cannons, the last bastion of a desperate empire. But there was nothing. The system was open, unguarded, and the sanctuary itself. It was not the blazing sun of power he had imagined. It was a world of breathtaking, heartbreaking beauty. Its continents were woven from the same living coral as the spire, glowing with a soft, internal light. Its oceans were silver, and its atmosphere swirled with iridescent clouds. But there was a fragility to it, a sense of deep, abiding melancholy. It felt less like a throne world and more like a magnificent, self-aware museum. They descended into the atmosphere, their cloaked ship causing no ripples in the planet's automated traffic control. They were a knife slipping between the ribs of a sleeping giant. Kalen's hands went to the controls for the vacancy strain. This was the final act. One canister released into this perfectly balanced ecosystem would be enough. The chorus would be silenced forever. But he hesitated. Lyra's words echoed in his mind. Is this our life now, as they hovered over a city of impossibly delicate, crystalline towers? A message appeared on their view screen, not a demand or a threat. It was a simple, elegant string of Ethel script, an invitation. It gave them coordinates to a landing platform in the heart of the capital. It was a trap. It had to be, but his scientific curiosity, the part of him that had not been cauterized by hatred, won out. He had to know why. Why would they simply invite him in? He guided the Stellarid to the designated platform, a disk of pure white floating in a sea of luminous gardens. The moment they landed, the ship's systems went dead. They were trapped. The ramp lowered, revealing a single Ethel standing there. It was ancient, its light softer, deeper than any Kalen had ever seen. It did not glide, it stood, its feet planted firmly on the ground, a gesture of profound humility. Its thoughtcast was not a broadcast, but a gentle, intimate whisper that seemed to form directly in their minds. "Welcome, Kalen Vance. We have been waiting." Kalen raised his rifle, but the gesture felt absurd. Lyra stood slightly behind him, her hand resting on the small sidearm she now carried everywhere. "You are the architect of our end," the Ethel continued, its form showing no fear. "The great silence. It sweeps through our worlds, and we are helpless to stop it. You have given us back the gift we abandoned eons ago, the gift of an ending." "You killed my wife," Kalen said, the words feeling thin, rehearsed. "Yes, one of our own, Xylo, severed from the chorus by his isolation and pride, made a choice born of callousness. an unforgivable choice. He broke our first and only law that our eternity must never be bought with the suffering of the transient. He, and all like him, had forgotten the truth we built our civilization to escape. The Ethel extended a slender hand, and the air around them shimmered. Kalen was no longer on a landing platform. He was adrift in a sea of pure light and sound. The lumen, the collective consciousness of the Ethel. He was inside their soul. He felt their history, not as a story, but as a direct experience. He felt their terror as a young species, hounded by mortality, by the chaos of raw emotion. He felt their discovery of the lumen, the blissful surrender of their individuality to the serene, silent chorus. And then he felt the cost, the slow fading of passion, of grief, of love, of all the messy, painful, beautiful things that made life worth living. Their immortality was a cage, a self-imposed prison of perfect, empty peace. They were not gods. They were exhibits, preserved in a state of eternal, unchanging serenity. Your weapon does not just kill us, the collective mind whispered. It does something far more terrifying. It severs us from the chorus. It casts us back into the screaming silence of the self, alone, terrified, and then it lets us die. You did not bring us death. You brought us hell. Kalen felt the agony of 1 billion minds as they were ripped from their connection, the sheer, unadulterated terror of their final moments. He saw his own hatred mirrored in their fear. He saw the face of Xylo, not as a monster, but as a being so insulated from reality that it could no longer comprehend the value of a single, fleeting life. The vision faded. He was back on the platform, gasping, his rifle lowered. The ancient Ethel stood before him, its light flickering. We will not stop you. If our extinction is the price for Xylo's sin, we will pay it. Release your plague. End the song. That is your choice. He looked at the canister in his hand. The end of a civilization. The final, absolute victory. He had won. But it felt like ash in his mouth. He looked at Lyra. Her face was streaked with tears. She had seen it, too. She was looking at the ancient Ethel, and for the first time since her mother's death, her eyes held not hate, but a profound, aching empathy. "Papa," she whispered, her voice trembling. What would Mama want, Ilara? He saw her face, not as she died, but as she lived. Her laughter as she held a newborn Lyra, her frustration as she fixed a complex piece of machinery, her hand in his as they looked out at the simulated stars from their quarters. She had been defined by her capacity to build, to mend, to love. She would not have wanted this galaxy of tombs. His promise to her was not to avenge her death, but to save their daughter. And he saw now, with devastating clarity, that he was about to fail. He was about to sacrifice his daughter's soul for the sake of his own pride. He let the rifle clatter to the deck. He walked to the edge of the platform, the canister of the vacancy strain in his hand. Below him, the beautiful, sad city of the Ethel waited for its judgment. He could end it all. He could have his silence, or he could choose something else. He turned back to the Stellara. Lyra, reconfigure the ship's main comms array. Don't broadcast the strain. I'm going to give them something else. He returned not to the lab, but to the ship's archives, to the personal logs he had kept since Lyra was born. He pulled up every image of Ilara, every recording of her voice, every memory he had of their life together, the love, the arguments, the quiet moments, the crushing grief of her loss. He packaged it all, the messy, chaotic, painful, beautiful truth of a short human life. He linked it to the comms array, and instead of a plague of death, he aimed a broadcast of pure, unshielded memory directly into the heart of the Ethel Collective. He pressed the button. The ship shuddered as it sent a wave of raw, human experience crashing into the serene sea of the Lumen. It was not a weapon of death, but of life. He was giving them back everything they had surrendered: the pain of loss, the fierceness of love, the terror of mortality. He was infecting their eternity with humanity. The ancient Ethel crumpled, its light flickering wildly as it was overwhelmed by a flood of emotions it had not felt in millennia. Across the planet and across the galaxy, the serene chorus of the Ethel shattered into 1 billion individual voices, screaming, weeping, and for the first time, truly living. Kalen took Lyra's hand. The Stellaris systems hummed back to life. The Ethel had released them. He guided the ship back into the sky, leaving the sanctuary to grapple with its newfound, terrible gift. The Dominion was broken, its future uncertain. The Ethel would not go extinct, but they would be forever changed, haunted by the memory of a human woman they had never met. As they drifted in the quiet of space, Lyra leaned her head against his shoulder. The silence in the cockpit was no longer heavy or oppressive. It was peaceful. "Papa," she said softly, "tell me a story about Earth." Kalen looked at his daughter, truly saw her for the first time in months, and a smile, the first genuine smile since before the purge, touched his lips. "It's a world with a real sky," he began, his voice thick with tears he no longer had to hide. "And the oceans are blue, and the grass is green." He spoke, and she listened, and the ghost ship flew on. 2 survivors adrift in a galaxy they had broken, and, in doing so, had finally set themselves free.